Hello, this is Brian Kelly, and this is the Thursday edition of the Small Business Briefing. I'm the President and CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan. Thank you so much for joining us today. And it's a little bit different. So Sarah Miller, who is normally my co-conspirator in this endeavor, is on vacation. And so I am joined by Alexa Kramer, who you've seen as a guest on here before, talking about all kinds of things that are happening in the political world, as she is our Director of Government Operations. So thanks for pitching in today, Alexa.
Thanks for having me, Brian. And I promised you that I would do my best Sarah Miller impersonation, so I will do my best to live up to that promise. But on Thursdays, we like to welcome new members. So this week, SBAM welcomes new premium member Hydras, purified and simplified water for residential, commercial, and industrial. Hydras is located in Grand Rapids. So we would like to welcome founder Scott Yockey and his team to the SBAM team.
All right.
Brian, lots to cover. Go ahead and turn it back to you.
Great, thank you. So the new member feature is kind of a new thing that we've been doing for the last several months, and courtesy of Marana Group, who has been our original sponsor, still with us on this small business briefing. And we talked about on Monday a new industry in Michigan that really has come on strong in terms of employment in the marijuana industry. Now at Michigan, number 3 in terms of employment in the entire country at around 30,000, which is pretty big. But we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into that. So we have invited Chris Jackson, who's a serial entrepreneur. He's got a lot of things going. Member of SBAM's Leadership Council, has been an awesome addition to that, and he's in the business. So Chris Jackson, could you give us just a a quick overview on the things that you're involved in and how long you've been doing it.
For sure. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for what you do. Really enjoy the briefings, have been for probably since the pandemic, right? When you were off the side of the road, right? So Chris Jackson, from Pontiac, Michigan originally. I am a part of the Leadership Council with SBAM. I'm happy to be contributing there. Partner in Sticky Cannabis operations. And so Sticky has multiple dispensaries or provisioning centers in Michigan across the state. So you have Ypsilanti, Battle Creek, soon to be River Rouge, and Muskegon as well. Working on a grow or cultivation facility in Reotown, Lansing. So we'll be having a Lansing footprint in a minute. I'm also just newly elected vice chair of the National Cannabis Industry Association, the NCIA, which is the largest and oldest membership association related to cannabis in the United States, at least. And I've also participated with MRA. So Andrew Brisboe, of course, is the director of the MRA. He put together a racial task force work group to help make the industry more equitable in Michigan. So I was a part of that task force, and also I sit on the diversity, equity, and inclusion standing work group with the MRA today. So those are all things cannabis related. And then more recently, the Lansing Pharaohs, the professional basketball team that's headed to and in Lansing, first home game on March 18th for those of you in the Lansing region. So it's a quick plug.
All right. Yeah, very good. Well, and actually, let's start there. If somebody wanted to go to see the first game, where and how would they get tickets?
Absolutely. LansingPharaohs.com. Tickets are available, and we will be playing at the Don Johnson Fieldhouse, the historic Don Johnson Fieldhouse where Jay Vincent and Magic Johnson made it so famous back in the day, right? So really looking forward to that. March 18th is opening day for us.
All right, awesome. Well, we love to have industry leaders in their industry as part of the SBAM family. So Chris, thanks for being with us today, and also being a part of the Leadership Council. And we've really got a lot to learn from you and your business. If we maybe just give us some insight in terms of what this journey has been. It's heavily regulated business, one that you got a lot of complications in terms of something that the rest of us take for granted, banking as an example. it's pretty expensive to bank a marijuana business, and not a lot of options compared to whatever everybody else has. But then also there's the governmental approvals and all the other things that come along with this business. So maybe just talk about your journey and getting into it and how that's been, and then after that, let's get into the future.
For sure. The cannabis industry is in its infant stages in the grand scheme of things, right? The last prohibition era business would have been alcohol all of those years ago, right? And so with that, there's this constant changing and arranging of laws. And I will say this much. I do give the MRA credit because back in the dark days of license approvals, right, there was a board that basically said yay or nay based on their own quote unquote objective but subjective perspective or opinions related to the person that was filing for the license, right? A really good example of that would have been the fact that Calvin Johnson got denied because of Megatron got denied because of a parking ticket in the past, right? So shouts out to the MRA because it's become far more systemized or systematic, I guess, with regards to how they actually give licenses, right? It became easier. One of the interesting things about Michigan is that they promote free market in a lot of ways. And so in other words, there is no cap at the state level to how many licenses are given out to people who qualify. Now, some folks will look at that and say that's a good thing for free market economy. Others will look at it and say, it's kind of a race to the bottom, very similar to, Oregon in this case now, where cultivation and plants are at, just to put it in perspective, $800 a pound. There was a time in Michigan where, given the supply and demand, it was at $4,000 a pound. It's dropped significantly now to probably closer to, $2,000, maybe even $1,500 a pound. And it's because there's more supply. So there's obviously a supply demand curve that occurs. Whereas if you have a state like Illinois, which we call an oligarchy state in this case, there's a cap or a limit on how many cultivation facilities actually can have licenses, which means they really control the market from that perspective. And so depending on who you're talking to, some may say that's a great thing, others may say it's not. One thing is for certain though, you mentioned the growth in jobs and the ability for folks to work in our industry, and even just the amount of revenue. Last year to this year, month over month, Michigan is, I think, in the top 3, even in revenue right now across the state, across the country. So something is going right. Director Brisboe and his team, it's hard to get it perfect. I don't think there's any is that you're not going to make everybody happy. But I will say things have increasingly gotten better, at least from a systematic perspective. Now, how you feel about other things, it depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah, and it has been I've noticed, been kind of rough and tumble and thinking about, how licenses are given out and who can do what, and there's different divisions of the business. But I would agree that Andrew Brisboe certainly has seemed to be able to kind of thread the needle and make improvements and generally help a brand new industry to grow and thrive in Michigan. Why don't we finish up with what you've involved at the national level too? What are the prospects that the feds are going to recognize and kind of release banks to just jump in? I've noticed more and more banks are starting to do it. The first few didn't get really in trouble, so others are getting into the mix, and maybe it'll just happen anyway. But it certainly would be better if the feds would recognize that some states have taken these steps for legalization and regulation, and it's time to normalize the banking relationships.
Absolutely. And to your point, it was kind of a wait and see what happens to the others first, right? And so a number of credit unions, a number of banks in Michigan in particular, I think have led the way even across the country regarding banking opportunities. It's important for everybody in this industry in particular. It's interesting how everything else is overly secured in this industry, which I don't think is a bad thing. Overly secured meaning there's high alert security, but that's not the case for the bags of cash that are either kept in the facility and or leaving the facility on a daily basis. And so Michigan has done, Michigan banking partners, for those few, have done a lot with regards to making it easier and safer for that. And I guess speaking of safer, right, there's the Safe Banking Act that the industry in a lot of ways are trying to push. And here's what's interesting, and I guess the Safe Banking Act, to put it in perspective, would allow for banking for cannabis businesses at a federal level. The interesting thing with that is that, you know, the House of Representatives have approved the Safe Banking Act 3 or 4 times now, and it just hasn't gotten through the Senate. And so now Congress is trying to be creative in how they promote it or present it. You know, if you're asking me my perspective on what I think is going to happen, if I'm looking in the crystal ball, you know, Democrats, I think, have put themselves in a tough and not because it's not the right thing. Like, so Democrats are, or I should say there are a few Democrats at the federal level that are pushing for decriminalization completely, right? And with decriminalization, it means access to research, to opportunity, to a lot of other things. So I think that's the thing, that's the smart thing to do. However, you have some Democrats that would say, you know, without everything, we aren't doing anything incrementally, right? And so if you were to ask me what I think is going to happen, I believe that, you know, the Democrats have put themselves in the tough position to where they almost have to push for all of it instead of some of it. Whereas I think Republicans are starting to see how safe banking would actually benefit the economy in its totality. And if the elections follow what we anticipate they will come midterms and how things shift, they won't be held to the same standard, right? Because it's almost, we're moving forward a little bit versus trying to do it all at once. And so I think safe banking will probably pass under a majority Republican government. You know, whether or not that happens, we'll see. But I just kind of see that as the next logical step in the progression of incremental growth with regards to laws in the cannabis industry.
Yeah, you know, that's oftentimes is how it works. You know, you got a group that everybody agrees that, you know, that the Safe Banking Act makes sense, or almost everybody does. It's a matter, though, of whether or not you can move that just itself, or if you got to add, you know, larger decriminalization to get some people on board. And so I really appreciate the insight. By the way, SBM does support the Safe Banking Act.
Yeah.
We have the last couple of times that it went through the House and encouraged it at the federal level too. Normalization of banking for all businesses legal in Michigan makes all the sense in the world. Chris, thanks so much for shedding some light on this new industry. Congratulations on your growth and success. And don't forget lansingpharaohs.com to see that opening game. It's really exciting to have a professional basketball team in Lansing. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Looking forward to seeing you all there too. Appreciate you.
All right. Very good.
Thanks, Chris. So Brian, we have just a few things to cover today. So let's go ahead and get started. First and foremost being the State of the Union address. So earlier this week, you and I were going back and forth about what might be covered in this State of the Union. And so share with us, how did your predictions stack up with what President Biden talked about?
Yeah, you know, I expected that the president would end up doing a scaled back version of Build Back Better, but you never heard him say the words Build Back Better. So I guess you'd call that scaled back, like completely throwing away the term. And now, it doesn't mean that the initiatives were abandoned. Instead, you saw that the president make a major shift in the use of the language and talking about it. Before, it was great society level changes, you know, new Deal era, you know, shift, and try to capture people's imagination with how big it is, that clearly didn't work, didn't sell, and it got stalled out. So you see what you saw is, scrapping the overall message of Build Back Better, and instead of talking about the same initiatives in big grand terms, it was pulling them out one by one and trying to make them seem smaller, like a literal 180 on messaging. But the overall initiatives themselves were pretty similar. Didn't get into a lot of detail, but I looked at it like it was essentially the end of the Build Back Better agenda, but broken into pieces and talked about separately, and trying to almost de-emphasize the size of them in order to reframe the discussion and not make it seem so radically different than how things are done today.
Yeah, his finesse on the language was interesting to me. You always think about what might be covered that would be interesting or surprising. Anything that really surprised you?
Well, there were a few surprises to me in it, and it wasn't necessarily on the content. The first was that we knew, and we've covered on the briefing, that that President Biden's pollster had some recommendations that all Democrats should move away from talking about the pandemic era mask and regulation and vaccine mandates, to move past all that and into a new phase. And so what you saw was barely a month removed from the strike down of an indoor workplace vaccine mandate in the Supreme Court, you saw the president come into the State of the Union address without wearing a mask himself. Now, the president has been quite disciplined about not wearing a mask when he's speaking, but when he goes through a room and with people and to go up to the podium, and he always has before. He didn't during this night. I was a little bit surprised by that. The people that were seated by him and behind him were not wearing masks either. And while that's not surprising in terms of, look across the landscape, that's where Americans are, but the leadership in the Biden administration have been among the last to kind of move in that direction, and they picked one heck of a stage to kind of send that signal. So it wasn't words that were said, but rather the projection gave me more confidence than ever that this administration really is abandoning the posture that it has had on kind of COVID zero type strategies, and embracing that it's a new normal and it's time to get on with a more normal type of an approach toward life.
So overall, how would you say that the president did? Did he nail all the opportunities that he should have taken? Did he capitalize on where he should have? What would you grade President Biden?
I think on the front of international policy that he did position things pretty well. So it's foreign policy has been kind of the bane of this administration with how the exit in Afghanistan went, and the idea that could have given enemies more confidence that the United States is not committed to international order. And so I thought he did a pretty good job on that front. Where I thought that he really missed an opportunity was to deliver something strong on inflation. He acknowledged that it existed and that it's tough, but especially in terms of fuel prices, failed to do some really common sense things that would have sent messages to the marketplace that would have had an immediate impact on oil futures and probably current prices. And so these are controversial things. It's not so easy for a Democrat to talk about the federal land leases and the Keystone Pipeline, but something in that area would have gone a long way. I think would have given him some breathing room. And on the inflation front, it was he acknowledged that it existed and that it was a problem, and I thought that was good. But the way of dealing with it was to essentially put more federal spending into it. And so it's the idea of, prices are higher, therefore we need to increase federal spending to help people deal with higher prices, as opposed to embracing the idea that we've got to get inflation under control. So I thought that was a big missed opportunity, and one that, I'm thinking, at least in terms of the fact that you've got a big midterm election. Headwinds seem to be against the Democrats for this midterm election. I think it was a missed opportunity to take a little bit of edge off those, because people are going to feel these gas prices, and there's nothing like gas prices to get to make people less confident. Their paychecks going, not going as far as it used to already. You put dramatically higher gas prices. We saw, like, around here about $3.90 a gallon. That's pretty dang high, and it can spell some trouble in terms of dampening the economic growth and the prospects here in the future. So I think that was the biggest missed opportunity, where he really could have spoken to that more and taken some steps that frankly are easily available, maybe hard on the left side of the political spectrum to swallow, but could have made a big difference for that centrist, the middle of the political spectrum, which I think is really poised to kind of go against the president's party in the next election.
Yep, absolutely. I'd have to agree with you on that. Going back to one of your point now, kind of shifting to Congress and the old saying, right? The president proposes, Congress disposes. What are the prospects when you talk about those moderate Democrats? What are the prospects with them that Biden has, historically struggled to keep them on board before?
Yeah, and I think this is where something has to change, right? Because it doesn't really matter how it's presented. The speech, I think generally, I saw some kind of snap polling, and that it was received well by most Americans. But but there's a difference between how people feel about a speech and how and then what happens next. And because the feelings from the speech wear off, the actions are what stick. And so Senator Manchin from West Virginia, we've talked about him many times. That's between him and Senator Sinema from Arizona are really the two main, not the only two, but the main two Democrats that need to get on board. What Manchin said was a little bit more clear than I was expecting. First was that he would consider undoing some of the President Trump's tax cut from 2016, and that whatever was done needed by the majorities, the Democrats in the House and the Senate right now, that it needed to fit within that. So you want to generate additional government revenue by scaling back some of those 2016 tax cuts, then fund a new program and consider the cost. And he was pretty explicit, considering the cost for the full 10-year period. None of these accounting gimmicks that they tried last year to make it look like it wasn't as big, where they said we're going to raise taxes for 10 years and we're going to consider spending on these programs for only 3 years, and then do the calculation over 10 years and say, hey, it reduces the deficit. None of that stuff. A program, what does it take to fund that program for the full 10 years that the Congressional Budget Office considers in their projections, and fit that within whatever new revenue that they want to create. So basically what he's doing is he's taking additional deficit spending off the table. He's saying he'll go along with some of these things that the president wants to do, but only if they have revenue generation to pay for it. And that will be a constriction that I think it will be very difficult for Congress to live within, because it is not in their nature to balance their spending. It's just not. And so I think that they'll have some trouble with that. But at least Manchin gave them a direction that they could go. So if the president doesn't want to come out of this thing with a goose egg, I think he's got a roadmap to do something. Now, how they will prioritize, Manchin gave a hint, like prescription drug, lowering the cost of prescription drugs is one of the things that was on the president's list that Manchin kind of liked. So I think he sent the hints, the clues on something much more modest that could be done, but it remains to be seen whether or not Washington and Congress can scale their expectations back down to something of that size.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and shift from federal government to state government. The last time that I was on, I believe I was talking about Governor Whitmer's budget recommendation for fiscal year 2023, just over $74 billion. It's right with a B, $74 billion. We're kind of in the heat of budget discussions and budget negotiations, and with all of the extra cash that we have that we're not used to here in Michigan, it's gotten a lot of us tax cut fever, I would say. And we saw some action in the legislature on that, with Republicans leading a tax cut plan. It is now kind of voted out and on its way to the governor's desk. And so, Brian, what did that tax plan include, and what do you expect those next steps to be?
Yeah, I mean, we saw the governor put a tax cut on the table in her budget, but it was very narrow, kind of targeted in at seniors and low income workers, and the earned income tax credit and the retirement exemptions. And it was somewhere between $700 and $800 million in total tax cuts, but again, very narrowly targeted. The House and the Senate had different versions of tax cuts, but both took a more wide view of reducing the rate on the individual income tax. It's at 4.25%. They wanted to get it down to 3.9%. And both plans were the same. Now the House and the Senate negotiated and settled. So the House and the Senate agreed on something, and that's what is required for them to send it on to the governor. And here's what they agreed on. First was to broadly give a tax cut in the rate, so 4.25% reduced to 3.9%. For our members like this, because it's that's the rate that they pay in their business income as pass-through entities. So it would be reducing that rate down to 3.9%. They also added a $500 per child tax credit into the mix, and they expanded the retirement exemptions, or the senior exemptions. So right now, $20,000 per senior or $40,000 per joint filers over age 67. The first 20 or 40,000 is exempt. What they're proposing is to make it that early exemption start at age 62, and it could be up to 40 and 80,000. So 40,000 per person, up to 80,000 for joint filers. There's a difference between earned income and retirement income, but generally speaking, it doubles the size of the senior exemptions and starts those senior exemptions early. So that's what the Republicans passed. They passed it in the House yesterday with some support. By the way, it was a bipartisan vote in the House, included several Democrats, and they happened to be Democrats that SBM has supported. So I always love to see, it's great for them to fill out our questionnaire and say that they support the things we support. It's even better to see them actually, their voting records show it. But anyway, it passed out of the House, then it went to the Senate. Senate just passed it a little while ago. So it is on its way to the governor. I don't think that the governor has publicly said whether or not it would be signed, although certainly have signaled that she is leaning toward a veto, calling it unsustainable. It's about a $2.5 billion tax cut overall. I think it is important, though, to consider context, that in the last 6 years, the state budget went from about $54 billion to $74 billion. So it's way, way bigger than it's ever been. Some of that is non-recurring revenue. Fed sent money, that money won't be sent again. So what the governor will say is it's not sustainable, because some of this revenue is going to go away, but a lot of it, there is a lot of new recurring revenue as well. All the state's revenue streams have gone up. So the idea that there would be some tax relief to citizens, certainly not an unrealistic or unreasonable proposition. So, but I kind of expect the governor will veto it. I guess we'll find out in the coming days.
Absolutely, and we do see Otis making his guest appearance. Very excited for him to be on the small business briefing today. So Brian, let's shift to some of the special primary elections that we had on March 1st. So there were 4 House seats up for the special election. There was a House seat in the Dearborn area, the 15th House District, the 36th in the Macomb County area, the 43rd in Oakland County, and then the 74th over in Kent County. So how did that shake out? And then a little bit on what these results mean for the future?
Yeah, in all 4 elections, I think that that basically the elections, there were 3 that were more Republican leaning districts and 1 Democratic leaning district. And so in each case, in all 4 cases, I think we did see a shift rightward. So in the districts that were already more conservative, they went with the further right side of the spectrum candidates, and also more toward outsiders. And then even in the district that is between the 2 main competitive Democrats in it, went with a business owner Democrat that we're actually fairly familiar with, and I think will probably represent the interests of small businesses quite well. And so I would say that generally it looks like the conventional wisdom about kind of how there's a rightward shift in the electorate. These elections bore that out. So long time between now and November, of course, but in this, it's kind of the rightward shift seemed to really confirm that.
Okay, so moving on then to some of the latest press releases we've seen from the governor. A lot of them have been focused on roads, which is kind of surprising. We haven't heard about roads in what feels like eons, but it's been a few years now. So what has changed, Brian? What's your insight on that?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we are at the next election cycle, and that it was a big thing. If you remember way back in the olden days of 2018, roads were the biggest issue, and throughout 2019 actually were really big issues that were on the table all the time. And then it kind of went off the radar screen for a while, but as life has gotten back to normal, we've got a particularly bad pothole season that is in front of us. The freeze-thaw cycle started in February this year. And that spells bad time for roads. National report put Michigan at the 3rd worst in terms of our pothole condition in the nation. So I think that probably the administration is feeling some heat about that. Like, well, this was the main thing of the previous election. Really haven't made a lot of progress yet. So we're seeing a lot of press releases now. I saw one that said like 19 bridges being fixed and 12 miles on this interstate being rebuilt. Normally you wouldn't see press releases on that stuff, but I think that there is some kind of heat starting, and therefore and then even an executive directive to the road agency that said, fix potholes faster. And I know, because I used to work in government, that the agencies don't like it. Like, they kind of feel like they're doing what they can. What did you think that we weren't fixing potholes already to the best of their ability? But so anyway, an executive directive put out. So there's a lot of attention. Expect to hear a lot more about roads. It was off the radar screen for a couple of years. It is back on the radar screen. We are out of time, so we've got a bunch of other issues to cover. So we'll cover those on Monday. But I do want to say thank you for joining us today and tuning in for the small business briefing. And still, this far into this briefing, we are seeing tons of issues to continue to talk about, and we'll look forward to seeing you again on Monday.
See you then. Bye.